Have you ever felt so triggered you were stopped in your tracks, didn't know what to say or do, were too scared to respond? Or you were so angry you lashed out in ways that were counterproductive or had long-term consequences? Triggering events are those moments when we experience an unexpected wave of emotion and we feel hooked. Sometimes we respond effectively with conscious intention, but more often we respond in a split second, unconsciously, and mostly say and do things we later regret. We all seem to have triggers when people say or do things that push our buttons, and we have these automatic reflexes, seemingly uncontrollable reactions. If you're like most people, you'll have a range of feelings at different times when you're triggered. Everything from anger, fear, shame, sadness, embarrassment, even excitement, joy, or gratitude. I remember a time when a male colleague and I were consulting to the senior leader of an organization. I was discussing an innovative idea I was really excited about. And then the senior leader interrupted me mid-sentence, turned to my colleague and said, "How realistic is this?" I had an instant hit of anger and felt dismissed and unimportant. I now see how his behavior re-triggered the multiple times throughout my career when men were assumed to be the authority and smarter, and women's credibility and wisdom were often questioned. I wanted to stand up for myself and call the leader in their behavior, but I also was afraid that if I spoke up, the situation would escalate, damage my relationship with this leader, and possibly have career implications. I didn't know how to respond effectively, so I just sat there and did nothing. Well, not nothing. I was fuming and replaying the incident over and over in my mind. By the time I refocused back on their conversation, they had finished up, and I'd missed a lot. I just felt too depleted to re-engage in the conversation. Something had happened, a stimulus. In this case, the leader's behavior. And in a split second, I felt triggered. I felt a wave of unexpected, intense emotions. I was knocked off my game, distracted, disoriented, and so de-skilled I couldn't figure out what to do. When we feel triggered, we react in one of three ways: fight, flight, or freeze. In this situation, I froze. I wanted to flee and I wanted to fight. It took everything I could do to stay in the room and not do something I might regret. In that moment, I had no awareness of why I had felt so triggered or what was fueling my feelings and reactions. Now, in the past, I've been able to handle very effectively similar situations, but that day, in that moment, when the leader turned away from me, it reactivated some old, unresolved issues I only later unpacked. I call these intrapersonal roots. Now I can see that the leader's shift in attention to my male colleague reminded me of times at my family dinner table when my father would turn away as I was talking to refocus on my brother, or times he would critique or question what I was saying. And I have no doubt that my reaction was also fueled by the cumulative impact of the gender dynamics I have experienced and observed so many times throughout my life. As I look back, I can now see a number of much more effective ways I could have responded. I could have honored the question while also exploring my ideas. And if I'd been able to stay engaged in the conversation, we may have found an even better solution together. But in that moment, I was reliving old issues in addition to dealing with what seemed very dismissive behavior, and I didn't have the capacity to respond productively. In deeply triggering situations, we can feel overwhelmed and out of control, and the intensity of our feelings is often disproportionate to the original stimulus. The depth of my emotions and the way I shut down had much more to do with the old dynamics that were re-triggered than the impact of the leader turning attention to my colleague. Now, I want to be clear. I believe the leader's action was inappropriate. And often when we feel triggered, the stimulating behavior is offensive and exclusionary. But there are two key points I want to summarize. While the original stimulus might be unproductive, our reaction is often out of proportion and connected to deep roots of recent and past experiences. And if we react unconsciously, we might undermine our effectiveness in the moment and respond in ways that have long-term implications. It has taken me my whole life to learn I can't control what happens around me, but I can choose how I will respond in that moment. Here's another example of a disproportionate reaction, a time when someone reacted with the fight mode, and we can see these same basic principles at play. I remember waiting in line to check into a hotel, and the person ahead of me, I'll call Chris, was muttering about being late for a conference call and how slow the service was. Now, it didn't seem particularly slow to me, so to be helpful, I said something like, it'll move along. When Chris got to the desk, the clerk seemed friendly and cordial, but then had trouble finding the reservation. After a moment or two, Chris, in a voice loud enough for many of us to hear, said how frustrated they were with the service and how incompetent the desk clerk was, and insisted upon talking with the manager. While it may have been somewhat frustrating not to be able to check in quickly, the depth of Chris's emotions, and from my perspective, the aggressive, belittling actions, were way out of proportion to the situation. I believe Chris was already a ticking time bomb, reacting out of the cumulative stress from maybe having a bad day, a tough week, or remembering what happened the last time someone was late to that conference call. Whatever the interpersonal roots fueling the reaction, Chris just snapped and then took it all out on the clerk, someone with less power and less status. Now, I can relate to Chris. There are many times I have felt triggered and treated others or myself in ways that violated my core values of respect and kindness. I often wish I had a do-over, that I could rewind what I had just done in a triggered haze or fast forward and hope no one had noticed. The good news is it's normal to feel deeply triggered, not something to be ashamed of or an indicator of incompetence. And while it's very common in a snap to react unproductively, there is this space in between the stimulus and the triggered reaction where we have a choice. As Viktor Frankl reminds us, we have the power to choose both our response and what impact we intend to have. I hope you realize you are not alone. Since all of us feel triggered at times, the goal is not to never feel triggered, but to develop the capacity in the ever-expanding toolkit to be conscious and intentional and choose how we will respond, to be thoughtful, not thoughtless. These skills can be useful in everything we do as faculty, teachers, parents, student leaders, coaches, managers, supervisors, frontline service providers. All of us can benefit from effectively navigating triggering events. As we work with others, particularly in a learning or developmental capacity, I believe we have an ethical responsibility to develop the competencies and self-awareness to model the skills and values we espouse, particularly when we feel triggered. In my workbook and other videos, I'll go deeper into these concepts as well as offer a wide variety of tools so each of us can say yes to the question, am I about to speak and act as the person I want to be? I want to thank you for taking the time to learn more about triggering events, and I look forward to our paths crossing again in the future.